folks, to Nafe Horsemanship. And today we're going to talk about saddles and some of the peculiarities of them. And well, to start with, I'm just going to step out of view here a little bit. And you can see that right behind me here is 3 saddles. These are 3 of my own saddles. And they all are Western saddles, but they are all different. And well, I'm going to talk about some of the differences and what you're going to see because, well, I discovered the hard way when I bought my first saddle because I discovered lots of things actually. I didn't have a clue what I was looking for. I didn't know what I was doing. And well, I'm going to try and save you a few $1,000s here because a good saddle can cost you $3 grand for a decent saddle. And you know, even an El Cheapo used one like that one at the end there, I think I paid $275 for that one, and then I spent another $150 on accessories for it to make it what it is today. So what's that? So it's over $400, and that's not even a good saddle. I'll talk about some of that too, is the difference between good and bad saddles, some of the things that you're going to discover, some of the things to look for too. But I want to talk primarily at the moment about fit. Now, I've discussed the fit on a horse before, but now I'm going to talk about the fit on you because that is, again, one of those things that I didn't know anything about when I bought my first saddle. And, well, I thought, most of the women I know, they're only 5 foot nothing or something, and, they're riding in a 15-inch saddle. So I'm thinking, well, I'm a guy. Guys are a lot bigger, right? I should have at least a 16-inch. So I bought my first saddle. It was a 16-inch. Well, it turns out, no, that was wrong. I needed a 15-inch because, well, the backside on men isn't as big as the backside on women, in spite of our height and the width of our shoulders and all this other stuff. But just, again, we can't just go by the numbers. I'm going to show you on these ones here. I just discovered something interesting too. I actually took a tape measure, I measured them, and I discovered the one. Well, I guess it kind of depends on how you measure it, and that's one of those tricky things too, because generally when you talk about the seats on the various saddles, you talk about, well, how many inches they are. It's a 15 or 15 and a half or 16 inch, that sort of thing. But it's not unlike, well, any piece of clothing, particularly shoes. I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with that, is that depending on the maker, different brands, well, some are narrower, some are wider, some are longer, some are shorter. And you might take a 10 in one and an 11 in another, and, well, you get the idea. So different manufacturers, even though if you had 3 saddles that were all 15-inch, they all might fit you quite differently because there's a number of variables that you have to take into consideration. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to show you one of the things that is a difference with these 3 saddles. There's lots of differences actually between these 3 saddles, but one of the prime differences is that one and that one are both low backs, or shallow seat, or I don't know what they want to call it. Low back is generally the term. The seat's not very high. This one here, you'll notice, just looking at it, comparing, you can see sitting sideways, like this. This one's a deep seat. It's got a high back on it. Now, that alters your fit. And so if you have a 15-inch shallow, it's not going to fit the same as a 15-inch deep. So you can't just automatically say, well, I rode my buddy's saddle and 15-inch fit real good, so I'm going to go buy a 15. Well, it depends. You might buy a different make and a different style. You might get a high back where his was a low back, or vice versa, and you may need slightly different. You may need a 14 and a half or a 15 and a half, or who knows, maybe even a 16. And one of those things that a lot of people get concerned about is, a saddle that's too big. They get a 16 instead of a 15, and it's like, I feel like I'm swimming around in that thing. You know what? You're better off with a saddle that's a little bit loose. Trust me on this one. I have been in saddles anywhere from 14 to 16 inch, and that 14 inch was very uncomfortable. I didn't feel at all, I couldn't adjust myself properly. I felt cramped. It wasn't good. The 16 inch, actually this one in particular right here, this is a 16 inch saddle, which I didn't know at the time when I bought it. Now this was actually a fairly expensive saddle, and I bought this particular saddle because of its tree. Now this saddle, I mentioned if you've ever watched lots of my videos, you've seen all three of these saddles in use. This one though is an Arabian tree saddle, and it fits the horse slightly different. It's got a few different dimensions on it that I'm not going to get into right now, but I was more concerned about that than the seat size. And when I bought the thing, I'm pretty darn sure the guy told me it was a 15 inch seat, and silly me, I never actually measured it. And it wasn't until quite some time later, after I'd actually already sat in it a few times and thought it was just fine, I happened to look at the serial number on it, and I went to the website where I could actually check it, and right in the serial number it actually tells you what size seat. Turns out this is actually a 16 inch seat. Little did I know, and yet it seems okay to me, so I'm not too concerned about it. My number one priority is the saddle's got to fit the horse, and that's why I paid the money I did for this one, because the Arabian tree saddles are a little harder to get. They're not as common, so they generally demand a little higher price if you can find them. And I found it rather disturbing. One store I went to, the buyer that actually bought saddles had never even heard of an Arabian tree saddle. I thought that was really disturbing. But one of the other things you got to watch, though, is, and like I said, a 15 inch seat, if it's a deep seat, that may actually push you a little bit further forward, which means that you actually only got 15 inches, not 16. I don't know, or something like that. Maybe that's how it works. It also depends on where you measure from on the horn, because as you can see, two of these have got quite a slant to the horn, and if you measure at the top or at the bottom, you can change your measurement by an inch there. Also depends on where you measure on here. Are you going to measure from the back, or are you going to measure from the front? That can really throw you off, and if somebody else is selling the saddle, if you're buying a used saddle, if they measure it wrong and they measure from the back instead of the front, it's like, oh my goodness, this is an 18 inch saddle. That's way too big. No, actually it's not. It's according to, if you measure right to the edge here, and generally where it starts to roll over, and I've discovered that on all of them, is that's pretty much exactly where the measurement is, and you measure from the bottom of the horn, not the top, because if you measure from the top of the horn, my goodness, that's, like I said, that alters it by about an inch, measuring from the top and the bottom. But if you measure from the bottom of the horn to this part of the seat where it just starts to roll over, 16 inches on this one. But because it's a deep seat, it's a high back on it, it puts you a little further forward. You're not sitting as far back on this part. So although a 15 inch, might be the right size for you, if you get a deep seat, you might need a 16. So you can't just say, hey, I need a 15 inch saddle and go and buy one. And like I said, manufacturer to manufacturer, they're all a little bit different too. This one here was sold to me as a 15 inch. I never measured it, but guess what? It is in fact a 15 inch. This one here was also sold to me as a 15 inch. Guess what? It's a 16 inch. And you know what? This is the best fitting and most comfortable saddle I have ever sat on in my life. This thing's amazing. And this particular brand is a very high quality brand that the company's not in business anymore. They don't make these saddles anymore. This one here is actually about 40 years old, but it has been used very little. So it's still in very good shape, has many years left in it. And I actually got a pretty decent deal on it, I think, to get a decent quality saddle. But, I don't get hung up on the, is it the right size? Now, as long as it's not like a 14 inch, that would, if it's too small, that's definitely a problem. But if it happens to be too big, which this one actually is, which I didn't even realize until I just measured it just a few minutes ago before I turned the camera on, it's a 16 inch seat. Who'd have thunk it? I love that saddle. That was money well spent. Now, this one here, it's also too big for me, but you know what? Doesn't feel like it. This one here is actually a 15 inch. Well, it fits me just fine. Now, this will lead me into a few other variables, like I said, from one manufacturer to the other, you know, how they shape the saddle, every part of the saddle. Like, and if I look close at these ones, they're all just a little bit different. You know, this one is actually quite a bit wider in here, right in this part here. The seat itself is actually quite a bit wider, but remarkably, this thing is, like I said, it is comfortable, very comfortable. But the other thing you'll notice is on the horns, this one is a little more upright. These two are quite slanted. This one in particular has even got more of a slant. And then, you know, that's why I say if you measure from the wrong part of the horn, it's going to really mess up your measurement. And if somebody's selling a saddle, you know, they might be selling a 14, and it's, you know, they measured it up, and it's like, oh, oh my goodness, that's a 17-inch. No, it's not. Measure it from down there. It's a 15-inch. But if you measure it from up there and then just even a tiny bit too far back there, it can be anywhere from a 16.5 to 17-inch. It's measuring up as. So, you know, just saying that you need a certain dimension of a saddle isn't necessarily going to get you what you need. And there's a lot of other variables too. Like I said, you know, depending on how big your belly is, you know, you may need a little more room up front. And the size of seat really is irrelevant. You might have to start looking at, well, does the horn slope forward more? Like, you know, for example, this one, the horn slopes forward quite a bit. That would make a little more room for your belly than, say, this one, which has a much thicker horn and is more upright. This is actually a roping saddle, which is why it's got such a big horn. But, you know, then your swells or your tree or your fork or, well, this part here, okay? You'll notice on all three of these saddles, it's a little bit different shape. This one's quite rounded, fairly narrow. That would have certain advantages too. This one comes out quite a bit, actually. It's very pointy. That could actually get you hurt, or it could be to your advantage because it almost acts like a buck roll and gives you some security with your leg there. You know, putting your leg on there keeps you in the saddle a little better. So, you know, for some people that might work better. But the only true way of making sure that the saddle fits you well is to actually sit in it and try it out. Because, like I said, I've got both 16s and 15s here. And I determined years ago that a 15 was what I needed. But it turns out that I've got two 16s that are both quite comfortable and work quite well. Although the very first one I bought was, in fact, a 16, and it was too big. I didn't like that saddle at all. Well, it actually had some other issues, too, that I was unaware of at the time when I bought it. But, you know, this is just a couple of the things you want to watch for when you're buying a saddle and you want one to fit you properly, is you have to be aware of all of the things that make it fit. How big is your belly? How big are your thighs? How big is your backside? How big of a seat do you actually need? And then again, depending on the manufacturer, you know, how big, you know, because, for example, even in the same manufacturer, it can get confusing. Because, like I said, this is a high back. If I was to buy a saddle from this same company that was a low back, I would need a different size to be comfortable in it, to feel secure. So, you know, you got to be very careful. The only true way of telling what's going to work for you is, well, sit in it and try it out. Well, that's about as close as I can bring you in. Let's bunch the saddles together a little bit closer. But I want to show you a couple things on these saddles that you can probably see. I was talking about how this part of the saddle is a different shape, and you can maybe see it a little better looking right from the front on them. You can see how wide this one is, and the corners stick out quite a bit on it. This one here is quite narrow and rounded. This one here is kind of halfway in between. It's got a bit of a slope here. It's not as square as that first one, and it's not quite as pointy either. Those are things that you can be aware of too. And notice something else too. Now this is one thing I forgot to mention that is actually quite important depending on the size of your feet. Now you ladies with the smaller feet, this isn't going to be too much of an issue for you because you know, most saddles come, there's basically two sizes of stirrups that saddles come with the exception of, well, that one over there. It actually happens to come with slightly larger stirrups on it. The other one at the other end there, I actually bought stirrups for it that were slightly larger because, well, I happen to have big feet. And something that can be quite dangerous is if your foot gets stuck in a stirrup. You know, depending on the situation, it's just, you know, even if you do have a good horse that's not, you know, acting up or anything like that, it's a good idea to always have stirrups that fit loosely on your boots. You don't want to take a chance on your foot getting stuck in a stirrup. And if I was to try riding in regular size stirrups, well, that's exactly what would happen. I could get my foot in one, but I'm not going to get it out real easy, and not as quick as I'd like to be able to, which is why I make sure that, you know, well, with that one I didn't have to because they were already big enough. But you know, well, it's important. You know, make sure that depending on your size of feet, if you have big Sasquatch feet like mine, you better make sure that, you know, depending on the boots you like to wear while riding, you better make sure they fit in there. Like I said, there are two basic standard sizes. I can't remember what the exact dimensions are on them for the Western saddles, but most of them will come with one or the other. And if they don't come with the bigger ones, I generally go out and buy them, which is exactly what I did with that saddle right there, is I actually went out and bought stirrups for it. And it cost me another $100 and something. But when it comes to quality of saddles, I should probably mention too, is one of the easy ways to tell the general quality of the saddle is the weight. Because, well, a better quality saddle is generally made out of thicker materials. The trees are generally made out of better materials, which are heavier. So both of these saddles are actually quite a bit heavier than this one. Now this one, I didn't pay a lot for, and I knew it wasn't a particularly good saddle in the first place. Now, if you happen to recognize it, I don't care. Doesn't matter. The company hasn't been in business for quite some time. And so it's not like I'm going to be dissing anybody, but you know, it's actually a plastic tree. And from, you know, I've looked at it, I've reattached things to it, so I know what it's made out of. I've had this thing kind of half apart, and I know what it's made out of. Now, before you get all excited about the cheapo plastic or fiberglass trees that some saddles have, there's upsides and downsides. It's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. I've mentioned this before, you know, if it's properly made, if it doesn't have a twist and it fits the horse contours properly, there's nothing wrong with either one of those, and they're a whole lot lighter, which is one of the things I actually like about that saddle is it's light. It's very light. You can throw that thing around onto the horse and that, no problem. Those other two saddles, boy, you need a few muscles to throw them up on a horse. And if you happen to have a good-sized horse, you could have your work cut out for you, depending. Yep. I'll bring you in a little closer again, and I'm going to show you a couple other things that I want to talk about. And, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about saddle pads. I've talked about them before, but I thought, hey, we're talking about saddles. Why not? We're just going to, you know, it's very easy to do a very quick demonstration of what I'm talking about here. Now, what you're going to notice on these saddles is, well, this one has got a fairly thick pad. Actually, it's not as thick as it looks. It looks a lot thicker at the end because it's kind of spread out at the end. Further in, you can actually see where it's sewn together. And once you get in there, it's not near that thick. It looks thick, much thicker than it is. But it is, I believe that was a 5/8 when I bought it. And I don't think I'd ever buy one that thick again. Because, well, when I got this saddle, you'll see this one here is quite thin. And although it also has fuzzed out a bit at the end, not as bad, if you were to actually measure the inside, this is a 1/4-inch pad. It's actually quite thin. I don't think I'd go much more than maybe 3/8 so, because you don't really need a lot of padding if your saddle fits properly in the first place. And the thinner your pad, the better your saddle fits on the horse and sits on the horse. This one here, well, you don't see any pad at all, but that's because I don't use a pad. I use a blanket on that one, and I just actually left it in the tack room. I didn't bother bringing it in because of these two, I leave the pad underneath because I do something a little different than a lot of guys. I actually throw the saddle and the pad on together because it's just a whole lot easier. And so that's why they're sitting the way they are. That one, because I got a blanket for it, I actually throw them on separately because it's easier that way, because that blanket's so limp that, well, you're not going to get it to stay in place with the saddle of throwing them on together. So, but I want to show you something here, and I'm going to use this one here as an example. Actually, it doesn't really matter which one I use, but we'll say, oh no, actually maybe I'll use this one over here to start with. Now, one of the things that you'll hear that when it comes to horse saddle dimensions, you hear about gullet width. And there's always disputes as to exactly where you measure it. There, there, there. Well, you know what? None of those measurements are going to be horribly accurate. And if somebody tells you that your saddle is a 7-inch gullet, well, if the manufacturer actually says it is, that's probably what it is. But if you were to measure it, it's probably not going to measure 7-inch, because the measurement that they're using is a tree. They're measuring the tree, the width of the tree, and an unfinished saddle. The tree alone, nothing on it, none of this padding, and which is actually another thing is, if you actually measure it from here to here, that's an awful lot wider than what the gullet actually is, because if you feel down in here, the tree is way back here. It starts way back here. Right about where your first concho is where the tree is. And it's a lot narrower in there than it is out here. So you got a significant difference. So when somebody holds a tape measure up and says it's a such and such, it means nothing, because the actual manufacturer's measurements are on an unfinished tree on a naked saddle. Nothing on it, no leather, no fleece, nothing, just the tree. That's the dimensions. Now, one of the other things that, other than poor measuring, one of the other things that can significantly affect your gullet width is your saddle pad. And unfortunately, an awful lot of people get told by the store, you can solve all your problems with a different pad or thicker pad or more pads. And I've seen people stack them up using layers or using shims in them. They have air rides, gel pads, all kinds of stuff. And you know, those things are just, they're Band-Aids. They aren't actually, if your saddle is fitting your horse properly in the first place, and you have it in the proper position on the horse, it's not going to be much of a problem, and you aren't going to need to spend hundreds of dollars on special pads. But be careful, even these cheap ones, now I shouldn't say cheap, inexpensive. Both of these, the same company actually. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. Both the same manufacturer, very common actually. And all they are just wool felt. Wool felt, that's it. And that's about as good as you get, because it breathes, allows the horse to sweat and keep it from overheating, so you don't end up with a really bad wet patch where the saddle sits. But I want to show you something on the saddle, because going back to this one, because you can see good, because there's nothing in the way. You can see the width of the gullet. Now, if, for example, you got a 1/2-inch pad like that one, that's actually a 5/8, but say if it was a 1/2-inch, just to make the math real simple for you. If you got a 1/2-inch saddle pad underneath this saddle, and if that saddle was, say, a 7-inch gullet, and you put a 1/2-inch pad under there, you got a 1/2-inch on this side, 1/2-inch on this side, what happens to your gullet? All of a sudden your 7-inch gullet is now a 6-inch gullet. And if you actually need a wider one for your horse, using a thick pad is not going to do you any favors. It's actually going to narrow your gullet up by a full inch, just with a 1/2-inch pad. That's a thin one. That's thinner than this one. And I've seen people use much thicker ones. Apparently you can buy ones that are inches thick, I've heard of. I've never actually seen them, but I've heard. In fact, the people that sold me this saddle said that for some ranch work, because it's rather strenuous on the horse, they want lots of padding, and you can get up to a 3-inch pad. That sounds insane. I can't imagine having 3 inches underneath my saddle, between the saddle and the horse. That saddle is not going to stay on worth a darn. But anyhow, that's one of the things I wanted to show you. But while we're at it here, I want to show you something else. One of the other things I want to show you, besides Well, I've talked about a saddle that fits you, because that's important too. You want something that's comfortable. And, you know, if the saddle's a little bit big, that's okay. And, you know, one of the complaints that, you know, people often have is, you know, oh man, the saddle's too big. I feel like I'm swimming around in it, you know. And it's like, hey, learn to ride, okay? You know, that's why a lot of people will insist that you actually learn to ride bareback. And if you can't ride good bareback, you're not even allowed to have a saddle. And so you're riding properly. And if you learn to ride properly, it doesn't matter if that saddle's too big, because it's still way better than a bareback as far as security and that sort of thing goes. And personally, I have found that, well, like I said, I take a 15 normally, and turns out I got two 16s and didn't even know it, because, well, they just didn't bother me, because I don't ride the saddle, I ride the horse. And, but, okay, we talked about saddle fit for the human, and just a few of the variables, and how you have to be very careful on how things are measured, that sort of thing, seat, gullet, all kinds of stuff. You know, just go try it out. Throw it on your horse and sit on the thing and see if it fits you and the horse. That's the best thing you can do. And if somebody isn't willing to let you do that, just say, sorry, I'm not interested in your saddle. And even if they, you know, insist that you leave a deposit or something like that, you know, that can be risky too, because you might not get it back if you decide you want to take the saddle back. But then again, if you don't pay the full price, if you only pay a deposit, and if they don't want to give it back, you can keep the saddle, and let's not go there. You can end up being as shady as some of the people that are selling stuff. Anyhow, okay, we talked about saddle fit for the human. Talked a little bit about saddle fit for the horse. Before I go any further, I think I'm going to talk about one other thing, because although I've only seen it once, I have seen it, so I thought maybe I'd talk about it, because it can have a significant effect on how well a saddle works. I just want to quickly show you something on this one, that I actually owned one saddle that had this feature that I didn't like. I really didn't like, and it's the only saddle I've ever seen that had that. The rest of the saddle I really liked, but it was the one thing I did not like, is the fenders didn't swivel. Actually, even these ones don't move very much, but most fenders are attached at a single point, so they can swing back and forth. The one saddle that I had, though, and like I said, it was the only one I've ever seen like that, it was actually attached at 2 points, so it was rigid. There was zero movement back and forth. And that wouldn't have been quite so bad if they were a little bit further forward in the first place. But they weren't. They were a little too far back, more under me. And I always felt like I was going to fall on my nose onto the horse's neck, because the stirrups were just a little bit too far back for my liking. So that's something you can watch for. I don't know how many different saddles are like that. Like I said, that was the only one I've ever seen like that. But something to watch for, because it can happen. That feature can exist on a saddle, and personally, I find it undesirable. Now, if the stirrups happen to be in a good position for you for riding, if they're far enough forward or whatever, that you feel stable in them, then that's okay. It's not an issue. And a rigid stirrup, actually, in some ways, it kind of feels good. It's a little more solid. It's not necessarily all bad, except, like I said, on that one saddle I had, I didn't like the position of them. They were just a tiny bit too far back, and as a result, they made an unpleasant riding experience. I want to show you something. I actually did talk about this before. When I did a mounting video, I said that you should put your hand onto the horse's neck and don't grab the horn to pull yourself up when you're trying to get on, and put as little weight in the stirrup as possible so that you don't twist the saddle. And I'm going to show you here why. And I explained it, but it's kind of hard to see on a horse. But this, I think, is going to be a much better demonstration, because what you're going to get to see is the same thing that's actually happening, but you're going to see, you know, pretend this is the horse's withers right here. This is your horse's withers. Now, the withers, for those of you that don't know, should bear zero weight, no weight at all. That's why the saddles are shaped the way they are. They have the high, wide gullet to make room for the withers. Now, even on the sides, not just on the top, but even on the sides, there should be no pressure at all on the withers. It can be very, very uncomfortable to the horse. And if that part of the withers experiences any pressure at all, it can create a lot of problems. That horse sees you coming with a saddle, it's going to go, forget it, you're going to hurt me. Why? Because, well, either A, maybe your saddle doesn't fit right and it's actually hitting the withers. That's something to consider. And that's one of the, disadvantage of a thick pad is it actually narrows up your gullet, so it can end up putting pressure on the withers. And mounting techniques. I talked about how, having a cinch. A long time ago I mentioned this in a video. I said, if your cinch is too tight, that can be uncomfortable. That can be unpleasant to the horse. But a loose cinch can be just as bad, because especially if you do not use really good mounting techniques, you're going to twist your saddle. Now, I have proven in another video that if you use proper mounting techniques, you can not only get on the horse, but you can even ride the horse and then dismount without a cinch at all. So, very important. And what happens if you don't use proper mounting techniques? If you pull on this horn or put too much weight in the stirrup and you pull the saddle, it turns sideways like that, all of a sudden it's hitting the withers. And that can be extremely uncomfortable for the horse. And that's why it's very important that saddle fit and proper mounting techniques are employed to prevent that kind of thing from happening, because the saddle should stay like right there all the time. It should never hit the withers. If you're, stepping in the stirrups or pulling on this horn to the point where it comes over and hits the withers like that, that's going to be very uncomfortable for the horse. And even if your cinch is done up, now this is just on a saddle stand, but I'm doing this so you can see. And yeah, there's no cinch attaching it to the saddle stand, but that's not the point. That can also happen on a horse with a cinch done up, unless you got it extremely tight. And even sometimes when it's fairly tight, if you pull hard enough, if your weight's out too far, you put too much weight in the stirrup and hanging on to the horn in the back of the seat at the same time, and you pull on the saddle, you pull it sideways, it hits the withers, and that is very, very uncomfortable for the horse. And next thing you know, you're having problems. The horse won't stand still when you're trying to get on. You won't be able to get near the horse with a saddle because it knows what's coming. And, well, that can cause all kinds of problems. So there you go. A visual image of what happens when you don't mount proper, or if your cinch is too loose and the saddle very easily shifts when you're getting on, you're going to hit the withers, just like that. You're going to hit the withers, and that's going to be very painful to the horse, and it's going to create problems. So there you go, a little bit of talking about saddles, how you can make them fit you, some of the things to watch for when you're buying them, how measurements can be very deceiving. Don't think that just because the last time you sat in a saddle that worked, it was a 15-inch, don't think that that means you need a 15. You might need a 14.5, you might need a 15.5, you might even need a 16. And like I said, my own saddles, I got 3 of them here, and they range from 15 to 16 inch, and every one of them works just fine for me. And part of that is, again, like I said, ride the horse, not the saddle. Don't rely on the saddle for security. If the saddle gives you security, that's nice. And for some of us that don't have real good balance, as I get older, it's not as good, unfortunately. But, it helps. A good saddle helps. But I don't rely on it. I don't rely on that saddle to keep me where I need to be. So if it happens to be a tiny bit too big, that's okay. It's still going to be comfortable, and there's enough room in it that I can move around within the seat. And, being loose isn't really a horrible thing. If it's too big, like I said, I've ridden saddles that were too small. And that was a far less pleasant experience, I can assure you. So take your time when you're buying a saddle, look around, check out multiple manufacturers, and put your backside in that saddle and find out whether or not it's actually comfortable. Find out if it fits. Find out if it does the job for the size of your backside, the size of your thighs, the size of your belly, your seating position, everything. There's just so many variables that you cannot simply take a measurement on a seat and say, okay, I need a such and such. No, that doesn't work that way. You know, it's like trying on shoes, you know, depending on how sensitive your feet are too. I mean, I spent an entire day going from store to store to store, trying on pair after pair of shoes until I found some that fit, that I was happy with. The odd thing is, they were actually one of the cheapest ones that I'd looked at too. I was prepared to pay significantly more, but I didn't have to. I actually found something that was comfortable for a whole lot less. But anyhow, you know, don't think that a number means much. A number can be very deceptive, whether it's the seat size, your gullet width. Oh, I forgot to mention one other thing, and that actually comes up with this saddle too, because being that this is an Arabian tree saddle, the angle of the bars is actually slightly different. It's actually got a slightly lower angle. I talked about that in another video, and I actually, and it's a dimension that they never talk about when you're looking at saddles. You know, they talk about the gullet width, but they never talk about the angle of the bars. You know, they talk about your quarter, half, three-quarter, full quarter horse bars. I don't know what all the different bars things they are, have they, you know, all that stuff. They talk about that stuff, but they never actually talk about the angle. And if it's wrong, it's important. It can actually, and that's why I think of this one, because specifically the Arabian tree saddles have a lower angle. And the reason for that is because if you were to use a regular saddle, like say that one or this one on an Arabian, what would end up happening is the saddle would end up standing on the ends of the bars on their shoulders, and it would be quite uncomfortable for the horse because it's not going to lay down flat. The other thing is that these ones are actually slightly curved too. They're not perfectly flat and straight. They actually have a slight curve to them, you know, which is something else. And you don't necessarily have to have an Arabian for this to have the need of one of these saddles either, by the way. This saddle does fit other breeds of horses as well. And even one of my own horses of unknown breeding fits her like a glove. In fact, it's the first time I've ever had a saddle that fit that horse properly. Unfortunately, because of her shape, the cinch still doesn't work well on her, and nothing I can do about that. But the saddle itself at least fits well on her. That's a start. But then she's an old geriatric that we don't really ride and don't care if we ride, so it doesn't really matter. So anyhow, there you go. It doesn't really matter much, the size of the saddle. Even, you know, if you can get one that fits, that's comfortable to you, you know, this one here is, I find, amazingly comfortable. It's the most comfortable saddle I have ever sat in, and it is totally wrong for what I'm doing. And you know what? I don't care. It doesn't matter that it's wrong. Wrong. Depends who you talk to, you know. I'm not bulldogging steers and calf roping and all that stuff. That's the wrong saddle. But you know what? It also happens to be the most comfortable saddle I've ever sat in, and I don't care if it's wrong because, man, that is a nice saddle. It's also made out of decent material. If it's a barrel saddle or a show saddle or a roping saddle or a whatever saddle that isn't what you're doing, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Oh, hey, while we're on the subject of saddles, I'll show you another thing here. And it's about this one here. And it's a feature on this saddle that I forgot to mention. I was going to talk about this. Hey, something that you're going to notice on this particular saddle is it's got a rounded skirt. And there's a reason for that, is because this is an Arabian tree saddle. And now, not every single one will have this, but most of them do. And there's a reason for it, is because Arabians have a shorter back. Not always, but it's the only breed that does have one less vertebrae and one less rib, which makes for a shorter back, which means they actually need a shorter skirt. And that's why this skirt is actually a tiny bit shorter at the back, and they round it off. But don't think just because you see that, that means it's an Arabian tree saddle, because there actually are other saddles out there that have that feature as well. Now, one of the other saddles out there that actually has this rounded skirt on it is barrel saddles. And I always thought, well, I didn't really know the reasoning behind it, and I could still be wrong on it. I talked to some barrel racers, and they told me why they have it. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I don't know. But I thought it was because of all the sharp corners they're making, that they would like a rounded skirt so it doesn't interfere with the movement of the hips, because the horse has to turn pretty sharp corners going around those barrels. Turns out, no, that's not the reason. The reason they do that is for weight. Making the skirt as small as possible on a barrel saddle makes the saddle lighter, which means that they can run faster times. Well, at least that's the theory anyhow. So that's one more thing. Arabian tree saddles have the rounded skirt. Not all of them do, though. This is not the first one I've owned. I did own another one before. It had the square skirt, just like the other ones, but it was actually a little bit shorter. And barrel saddles frequently have this rounded skirt. So if you see a rounded skirt like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an Arabian tree saddle either. So don't be fooled into that one if somebody's trying to sell you an Arabian tree saddle. And it turns out actually it's a barrel saddle. But that's another thing, if you buy a barrel saddle and it's comfortable and it works for you, who cares, whatever. Don't get hung up on this. You got to have the right kind of saddle. And the plainer it is and the cheaper it is and the less tooling it has, it doesn't look as fancy. It's not going to impress your friends as much. You know what? It's going to be a whole lot easier to clean, because I can tell you that one that I got over there, it's got an awful lot of tooling on it, and believe me, does that thing collect dust. That tooling on there, that thing is a mess. Fortunately, it's also a cheap saddle. I don't really care, and I'll probably never clean it, because it's going to keep getting dusty again, because I use it in the arena here a lot for training purposes, and sometimes it even hits the dirt and ends up right in the sand, and I don't care, because that's the price of doing business with it. And that's one of the reasons I like keeping that one around, is that just in case it does end up on the ground, I don't care. I'm not going to lose sleep over that one. So that's one of the reasons I have more than one saddle, but I also have ones that suit different purposes too. Those two I use on two different horses because of their shape. This one is specially designed for one horse. That one fits very well on another horse. Both are very comfortable saddles, but that one there, man, I can't get over. Money well spent. Buy a good saddle. It's not, check it out, sit in it, and if it feels good, go, yep, I'll give you the money. Because what I paid for that one is less than half the price you would pay for a decent quality new saddle. And ones like this one here, these saddles can run, I can't remember, I know what the guy paid for it when he bought it new. And I am sure that with the pad and the dust cover that I have that goes with it and the custom tapaderos and all this stuff, to replace this saddle now would probably cost about $3,500, which I would never spend that kind of money new on a saddle, and that's why I bought this one used. It's still in really nice shape. It's been well cared for. It does show a little bit of sign of wear on it here and there, but nothing significant. It's not damaged in any way, shape, or form, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it that's going to affect my ability to use it. And this particular brand, I didn't hesitate to buy it because I know of it, and I've never owned one before, but I know lots of people that have, and they all swear by them. They think these things are just marvelous. And that's a company that's still in business, still making good, decent quality saddles. That one over there is a company that's been out of business for quite a few years, but if you can ever find one, that's a good saddle too. That one over there, they've been out of business for a long time, and that's not an expensive, that's not a great saddle, but it works, and it's good for what I use it for. It's like, in total, I mean, all three of these added together, you can easily, what I've spent on these three saddles, you can easily spend on one saddle, and quite a bit more actually. And I don't know what they top out at, but I have heard of people spending, I've seen on the interweb thing there, prices as high as $10,000 for a saddle, which I think is absolutely insane to pay that much for a saddle. I wouldn't pay that much for a horse. But even in local stores around here, it's not unusual to see $3,000 to $5,000 for a saddle. I'm trying to save you thousands of dollars here by taking a little bit of advice buying saddles right from the beginning that are a little more to what you need. They are a significant investment, and to get a decent one, you are going to have to pay a fair price. Now, for beginners, for a starter saddle, go buy a used one off of the, whatever your local site is or wherever, for a few $100s. That'll get you started, and while you have that one, you can be riding your horse, and you can learn about saddles, and you can learn about the do's and don'ts and things that features that you would like to have in a saddle, things to look for, and take into account a few of the things I've talked about, the importance of stirrup fit, the seat, the saddle fit on the horse, different features, and if you see hardware that's rusty, like on your cinch, if the buckle or the D-ring or whatever is rusty and looking kind of crappy, don't hesitate to replace it. These ones were a little more money. It's the same company as this one over here. This was a lower model, still a decent quality, and brand new. I can't remember what the heck I paid. I think it was only like $40 I paid for that one. And for $40, man, it's money well spent, very well spent. Money, like $40 for a cinch, that's pretty darn cheap. It can save your life, keep you from cracking your head on a rock somewhere. Like I said, these two here, they're both the same, and I think they were about $80. That was about half the price, because they just happened to have that one in stock at the time. So, anyhow, I think that'll kind of wrap it up. A couple of saddles that, different features and different gullets, different horns, different, like I said, the angle on these two, different. That one's almost straight up and down, also a lot thicker. When you're measuring the seat, measure from the bottom of the horn, because that's where you measure from the horn to this little ridge right here, where it starts to roll over. That's where you measure to, and, but that measurement doesn't mean a lot. Because like I said, high back, low back, high back, low back, and they all fit me. 16-inch, 15-inch, So, sit in the thing, find out if it works, and if it does, buy it. Have a good day.